Hey, welcome. This is Stephan from the Great World History book, and today we're gonna have a lecture about the Sayings of Confucius. Let's dig right in. Confucius is one of the most influential philosophers in all of Chinese history. Similar to Socrates in the West, Confucius presented a moral philosophy based on hard work, self-reflection, and the development of virtues. Most significantly, Confucius believed that people should not be judged based on their class or lineage, but instead on their dedication to these virtues. Some background information. The name Confucius is actually a westernized version of Kong Fu-zi, meaning Master Kong. So Confucius was actually just called Kong. Confucius was born in the 6th century BC in an era known as the Warring States period, and that name pretty much captured what the time was like. At this time, power was in the hands of dozens of small states that continually competed with each other through warfare. Interestingly, the misery caused by these wars prompted the development of many influential schools of philosophy, each hoping to remedy the situation. And here we see one of the early portraits of Confucius, and here we see a later one from some centuries later. This is probably not what Confucius looked like, since we don't have portraits from the exact time period when he lived, but just to give you an idea. Confucius was born in the state Lu. His father died soon after his birth, and he was raised in poverty by his mother. Although starting out in this lowly position, he slowly worked himself up, a truly self-made man. He first became keeper of granaries and livestock, then district officer, then minister of work, and finally minister of crime. But political rivalries eventually forced him to leave Lu. Hoping to find other leaders who would listen to his ideas, he wandered from state to state for 12 years with a group of disciples. But unfortunately, and this was a grave disappointment to him, no one was willing to listen. And here we see a map of the travels that he did during those 12 years. The state Lu is in the top right below Qi. At the age of 68, Confucius was finally invited back to his home state by the chief minister of Lu. There he finally got some of the respect he had been looking for he was approached for advice on various occasions by high politicians, and he also gathered about 70 disciples. In the last year of his life, Confucius was burdened by both the loss of his son and his favorite disciple, Yan Hui. Probably I'm not pronouncing that correctly. As a result, Confucius' life ended on a very sad note. One of his disciples wrote, "When Yan Hui died, the master wept with uncontrollable emotion. His follower said, 'Master, you have gone too far,' in his emotions. The master replied, 'Have I? For not for this man, for whom should I show so much sorrow?'" Confucius finally died of natural causes that same year, somewhere in his 70s. Now let's move to his teachings. His teachings were written down by his disciples in the form of questions and answers. It's a very readable work. It is called the Analects, sometimes also known as the Sayings of Confucius. The first thing that we learn in the Analects is that Confucius greatly valued learning. The opening line reads, "The master said, 'Is it not a pleasure to learn, and when it is timely, to practice what you have learned?'" That second part is also very important. For Chinese philosophers, knowledge was not just book knowledge, but it should be applied in the complexity of real life. His ability to see every interaction as an opportunity to learn was one of the essential elements of his teachings. We read, "The master said, 'When you meet a worthy person, think how you could become his equal. So what can you learn from him? And when you meet an unworthy person, turn inward as well and examine your own conduct. Perhaps you're displaying some of the same negative traits.' Another opportunity to learn." Confucius also encouraged his students to listen to constructive criticism, and he also allowed his students to criticize his own mistakes. We read, "I have been very fortunate, for if I make a mistake, others will be sure to let me know." He even called out students when they accepted his teachings without any critical thought. We read, "The master said, Yan Wei, his favorite student, is of no help to me. He is pleased with everything I say." Unlike many other sages of his time across the world, Confucius did not claim to have any special metaphysical knowledge about the gods, heavens, life after death, and so on. In fact, one of his students complained he was not willing to put forward abstract theories at all. We read, "We are allowed to hear Master's view on culture and goodness, but about the way of heaven he will not tell us anything." His student Jilu asked about how to serve the spirits of the dead and gods. The master said, "You can't even serve men properly. How can you serve the spirits?" So very down-to-earth man, very impressive for that time. But this didn't mean that Confucius did not believe in heaven or the gods. Of course he did, at the time that was common. But instead, he realized that that plane of existence could not be described or understood anyway, so let's just focus on the things that are within our reach. Now we move to the main goal of Confucius' teaching, and that was to become a nobleman. In Chinese, that is a junzi, literally meaning the son of a prince. Before his time, the word junzi had been reserved only for the aristocrats, but Confucius applied the term to anyone who had achieved a high level of moral and intellectual cultivation. Through dedicated hard work, he believed, anyone, poor or rich, could become a junzi. Confucius practiced as he preached, as always, for he had both rich and poor disciples, ranging from aristocrats to even the sons of criminals. The master said, "In teaching there should be no distinction of the classes," one of his famous quotes. According to Confucius, a junzi distinguished himself by cultivating a number of virtues. Reminiscent of Aristotle, he also considered the pursuit of these virtues to be a source of great joy and life satisfaction. The greatest of these virtues, according to Confucius, was Ren. Ren literally means two men, signifying kindness between people. We read, Zhang Gong, one of his students, asked about Ren. The master said, "When abroad, conduct yourself as if you were receiving an honored guest. When employing the people in your state, deport yourself as if you have been put in charge of a grand sacrifice." And then, one of his other famous quotes, "Do not impose on others what you do not desire for yourself." An alternative version of the Golden Rule, one of the most famous rules in ethics to this day. Another quote we read, "When encountering matters that involve Ren, do not even yield to your teacher." Another important virtue was qi, or wisdom, referring both to having knowledge and being able to apply it in an appropriate manner. An associated virtue was yang, or courage, meaning the ability to actually do the right thing, no matter how high the stakes. Knowledge alone is not enough. You need the courage to actually go through on what you believe is the right thing. We read, and this is a quote that made a very deep impact on me. The master said, "Only in the deepest of winter, meaning in the toughest time, do we realize that the pine and cypress, meaning the junzi, are the last to shed their leaves." This of course explains why during good times it is not so appealing to cultivate virtues, because it's difficult to spot the difference between someone with virtues and someone without. But during tough times, it shows why it was necessary in the end to cultivate those virtues. Humility was another important virtue according to Confucius, and Confucius often repeated that even he still had much to learn. The master said, "I'm able to work as hard as anyone, but as for being a junzi in practice and conduct, I have not gotten there yet." Very humble indeed. Not a great story about humbleness. When one of his disciples claimed he wasn't ready for a government position, Confucius was delighted, as this was just the kind of self-awareness that would make a good ruler. And this is the actual quote. The master encouraged his students to take office, but the students replied, "I am not confident I'm ready to take the next step." And then we read, the master was pleased. So this self-reflection was a good thing. Another important virtue was li, or ritual. Being a conservative man, Confucius believed that the traditions of the past could help solve the instability of his day. Those rituals could form the glue that held society together. According to Confucius, the rituals with their music and poetry could also awaken Ren in the people, make them more virtuous. As a result, Confucius is sometimes preoccupied in his texts with seemingly trivial ritualistic details, like when and where to bow during a ceremony, or what garbs to wear, and so on. And he seems truly offended when these rituals change against his wishes. Confucius also broadened the term li, or ritual, to mean something like good social behavior in general, suggesting that the gravity or earnest of the rituals should extend to all social interactions. Another virtue was xiao, or filial piety. In line with Chinese tradition, Confucius placed special emphasis on respectful treatment of parents, elders, and ancestors. He called for people to selflessly perform their roles in both society and in their families. If nowadays people know anything about Confucius, it's usually this fact, and it's usually interpreted a bit extreme, thinking that Confucius believed that you should respect authority at all costs, but this is not at all the case. As we have seen, students were allowed to criticize their masters, and in a similar way, sons and daughters were allowed to criticize their parents as well. Confucius advised to gently dissuade them in case they engaged in wrongdoing. So it's not unconditional acceptance of everything the parents do. It means just to treat them with some extra respect, to take some extra more time, because the stability of families, he believed, is the glue that holds society together. Makes sense. Confucius also famously advised rulers to select ministers and bureaucrats based not on their inherited status, like their birth, but based on their merit and virtue instead. And this was a revolutionary idea in the world. This idea finally caught on during the Han Dynasty, starting around 200 BC, which made Confucianism the official philosophy of China. The first Han Emperor, Gaozu, issued an historic edict in 196 BC, ordering local officials to seek out talented men across the country and send them to the capital to determine whether they would qualify for a government position. We read in one of these old texts, "If any among the people have an excellent reputation and manifest virtue, the officials must personally urge them to come to the capital, provide them with a chariot, and send them to go to the courts of the Chancellor of State to have written down their accomplishments and then see if they're eligible for office." In 165 BC, Emperor Wen formalized this practice, ordering officials to, quote, select men of excellence and integrity and subject them to the famous imperial examinations of China. Over the centuries, the system continued to expand, improving the chances of talented and virtuous men at some point from all levels of society to occupy various government positions. In the 7th century AD, so centuries later, even commoners were allowed to take the test, allowing for some social mobility, which at the time was revolutionary in the entire world. In the 10th century, the examinations became the primary method for recruitment of officials. And here we see a 17th century painting of the imperial examinations at work. And here we see another one from a century later, from the 18th century. Influenced by the Chinese, the Europeans finally adopted this meritocratic system, as it is called, only in the 17th century. And this was done first in the British East India Company. Company managers hired and promoted employees based on examinations, which are objective, in order to prevent corruption and favoritism in the company. Via the East India Company, the idea finally spread to the Western world, where various great thinkers such as Voltaire came to endorse it. And here we have another lecture on one of the great people of humanity. If you want to learn more about China or any other civilization that is important in world history, I advise you to buy my book, The Great World History Book. It can be bought at this point only at worldhistorybook.com. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot. See you next time.